Okay, that was a great start. Thanks to the new people who have arrived for coming along today. Our next speaker is Dr. Françoise Baylis, who's from Dalhousie University, where she's a chair in bioethics and philosophy. And her talk is entitled, I Am Who I Am, She Is Who She Is, When Illness and Technology Disrupt the Narrative Flow.
Well, thank you very much for being here and putting up with what I'm going to try to share with you today. So the title is actually really long, and normally I don't have such long titles, but I wanted to try and capture a presentation that's in some ways very odd and discordant because of what it tries to bring together, but what's unifying is this notion or concept of identity. So the I Am Who I Am refers to a paper that I published recently, which is specifically on deep brain stimulation and questions of identity. And I was really responding to claims that were being made that one of the problems was that deep brain stimulation was somehow a threat to identity and that we needed to therefore worry about what we were doing with this technology. The She Is Who She Is refers to a more recent project where I'm looking at Alzheimer's and identity, and the reference there to She Is Who She Is because that work is grounded in my lived experience with my mother who has Alzheimer's and is in the final stages of that illness. So that's where those two things come from, but in both cases I'm looking at questions of identity. And so what I'm interested in is what happens when people think about the illness or the intervention as a threat to identity, and what it is that we think allows us to hold on to identity in either of those kinds of contexts. So I too believe in the rule of three, but for a slightly different reason. I have friends that are reporters, and when I would go and talk to them about a story, they would always say, well, what's the third element? And I said, what do you mean? She said, it's the rule of three. You can't write something for the general public unless you've got three things in there somehow. So this is my three. I want to talk about personal identity, and that work is really deeply philosophical, and I hope it's just not boring for people who don't spend a lot of their time in their minds just thinking about things and concepts and theories. And what you'll see is that I'm really going to try to articulate and defend a particular theory of identity, which people may or may not agree with, and that's fine. But the thing I worry about is a lot of the reading that I do, people make these claims about identity without having told their readers what they think identity is about. So they'll say, well, it's a threat to identity, and I say, yeah, okay, well, what is it that you think is under threat? And they haven't actually unpacked the concept. And so I think it's really important to push on that. So I'm going to articulate my understanding of that concept, and as I said, you're welcome to disagree with it, and it's through those kinds of conversations that over time I think I'm making my own understanding, I hope, richer and truer to what might be relevant to some of the questions I want to ask. So you'll see the main elements there is that I think it's narrative. It has to do with the stories that we tell and that coalesce over time. I think it's relational. We don't live by ourselves in this world. None of us are. And there's really important work in philosophy about how, in fact, we're all second persons because we learn to be persons through other persons who, in fact, teach us what it means to be that. And I also want to then make a lot of claims about how it really needs to be understood as a dynamic concept and how, in many cases, we think of it, or at least we speak of it, as though it's somehow static. And I think you really hear that even in the language of a threat. When you say this is a threat to my identity, you think it's something that's solid out there that can come under threat in a particular way. I then want to talk specifically about deep brain stimulation, and the case study I'm going to use is a philosopher from Europe, Helmut Dubeel, and I'll put that in context at the time. And then the third part will be when I look at Alzheimer's disease and really then get to revisit some of the work I had done previously around identity, because I think when I turned to look at this illness, it allowed me to see and understand ways in which I needed to broaden sort of the original thesis that I had put forward. One of the things that I just want to say before I move into the account of identity that I want to offer to you is that it didn't start in this area. So my first piece on identity is actually about genetics and race, and it's in a paper called Black as Me, Narrative Identity. And one of the things that is both fascinating to me and disturbing to others is how people respond when I tell them that I'm black. And I am not Rachel Dolezal. And one of the things that's very interesting when I get to say that now, at a particular moment in time, is one of the reasons I get to do that is because I have a particular story I can tell which creates a certain kind of legitimacy. And that story, which is really important, is that my mother is the first successful case of racial discrimination in Canada under the Quebec Human Rights Code. So surely if my mother has been the victim of discrimination, and by the way, she did win. She won a total of $25. Yeah, I know, a moment in time.
Canadian dollars.
Canadian dollars on top of that, yes. Well, the story gets better. They actually refused to pay the fine, so the court case continued for several more years, and she won again, and the fine was increased to $50. Anyhow, the point is, because of the narrative, because of the context, because of the stories that I can tell around that, I get to make certain kinds of claims that will be pushed back, but as I add elements to that, then people are willing to accept my particular account of identity. But one of the things that's important when I get to tell that story is how we read identity off the body. And one of the things that I think becomes really important is when the body masks things that are very important to that person's sense of self. People can't read it off of the body, make mistakes, and that it can be very disruptive to relationships. Anyhow, so the first thing I want to say then is I started that work in about 2003. I wrote on race and genetics and identity. I then actually moved to face transplantation and identity. And it took me a little while till I got to the brain and deep brain stimulation. And all of that work was around specific interventions or specific healthcare contexts. And as is common for the work that I do, is that at some point I pull back. I pull back from the applied arena and I start to do sort of some theoretical work. And that is what resulted in this paper, which only comes out in 2012. And so I've told you this is now 10 years that I've been writing about identity and specific interventions. And now I pull back and I write this paper called The Self in Situ. And it's part of a collected edition which is all about relational theory. And so what I offer there is a relational account of identity. And the thing that's really important is that it's grounded in narrative. It's about the stories we're able to tell and hold together, and in fact have others participate in that understanding of what makes for it holding together. One of the elements that becomes really important is this claim that people are constituted through personal relationships. And in many cases, I think people don't understand what I mean about that, and I'm going to try and unpack it in a minute. And then the third point that's really important is that it's dynamic, it's social, it's cultural, it's political. It's not, I think, isolated in the way that we tend to think about it when we talk about things like the mind and the brain. And so one of the things that becomes really important is I don't think that my identity is in my body, even though I am an embodied individual. And I also don't think it's in my brain. It's not just about what I think in isolation. And when I make that claim, most people then are kind of confused. Well, where is it? And what I want to offer to you is the claim that my identity is actually sitting out here somewhere. And many people are going to find that kind of unusual. But the reason I say that is because, in fact, who I am ultimately is a function of who you and everybody else around me will allow me to be. If I think I'm this bright, brilliant, attractive philosopher, and that's not what you see, you're not going to give me any kind of cues or feedback that are going to allow me to keep projecting with confidence that that's who I am. And if I don't have any kind of social support or any kind of feedback loop that makes sense of who I think I am, over time, I'm going to have to shift. I'm either going to have to say, okay, they just don't get it. I'm going to have to do some other things to make sure they can really see me and who I am. And I'm going to have to perform in a particular kind of way. And so I'm going to go to greater lengths to make sure that you can see who I really am, or who I think I really am. And maybe you'll see some of that, and maybe you won't. And if we continue to have that discord, something has to give, or at least that's the claim I'm making. And that's either that I'm going to have to start shifting my sense of self until we can get to a particular point of understanding or equilibrium, or I'm actually going to have to leave this community and find another one who can really see the attractive, brilliant philosopher that I am. Now, the thing that becomes difficult about that is it doesn't make sense unless you're really going to accept that my identity is relational, and it's not going to make sense if you don't think that it's dynamic, and it's not going to make sense if you don't buy into the concept that it's about a narrative that I need to keep going and I need to sustain. And I need to be able to do that in a particular kind of context, which is very much performative. So that's why I make the claim that my identity is in fact negotiated. And the negotiations I'm talking about are not as overt as I have just described, right? So I don't think we sit there and say, okay, they're not really getting who I am, so I'm going to perform this other kind of way. I think this is all very subconscious, but it is in fact, I think, how we act and how we behave. We in fact all have roles that we play in different kinds of circles. And so some people will actually be aware of that and they'll say, yeah, I'm the clown in the family. And so when I'm crying, nobody actually really thinks it's real because I am the clown, so this must just all be part of the game that we always play. And so one of the things that becomes very difficult for people is how they get stuck in certain kinds of narratives and roles and aren't able to sort of reframe themselves and get the kind of endorsement they need for who they are. And in fact, because of the claims I'm making about it all being in some sense performative, I think we all are at some point in a play, and we have certain kinds of roles, and part of what happens is when we try to contest those roles, we can end up in trouble if we're not able to kind of negotiate that in some kind of way. But what really I think is important is the last line on that slide, which says, ultimately, that my identity is some kind of a balancing between how we see ourselves and how others see us. And that's why, for example, if we go back to the very first example I gave you with respect to race, it really matters to me that people accept the identity that I claim as a black person, and I really understand how that's very difficult for people. You know? And what's really interesting is, especially in contexts where people, I think, are racist, they'll say after I've disclosed this, oh yeah, but you're not like all the other ones. And you want to say, really? Really? What do you think that means? And how is it that you think somehow that's less racist than whatever it is that you were saying before? And I can tell you, in the context of my work, I'm always surprised about statements that people make when they don't understand that the only way you could make that statement is because you believe that we're all in the know about what that claim means. So I remember when I used to do clinical ethics work, I was working with the transplant team, and at the time we were expecting a young child to be airlifted from an Aboriginal community for a transplant. And the parents were not in agreement with the transplant for cultural and other reasons, did not want this for their child, and the social services had decided that they were therefore incompetent and therefore they were going to apprehend the child. In the team meeting with the transplant team, as we were waiting for this child to be brought to the hospital, very casually they say, oh yes, well they're Indian, but they're not like all the other Indians. And again, for somebody to say that means that you assume that your audience knows what it means to say, who are all the other Indians, right? So one of the things that's really important about identity is, in fact, how much of it is culturally constructed and dependent on a certain kind of set of narratives and knowledge about communities that we are supposed to be attached to or that we try to pull away from. And so again, to me, that speaks to the embeddedness of the assumptions that we make around who people are. So one of the things that comes from what I'm saying, which again is an important point of departure from what other people say, is I actually don't believe that there is such a thing as an authentic true self that is to be protected from profound changes. Now, an example that a colleague of mine uses, which is in the literature in a number of places and in different ways, talks about the priest who has lost his faith and who therefore goes to seek some kind of help and presents as a person with a very particular identity as a religious person, and now experiencing the threat of, I've lost my faith, and I need help. And it matters whether you think there is an authentic true self that needs to be gotten back to, or whether there's treatment that is to be offered, or whether you think, well, that's great, I'm glad you've lost your faith because before you were delusional, and now in fact you're in a much better place. You're not needing of any help whatsoever, right? And so one of the things that becomes, again, really important is how it is that we think of the person as being in a particular community, whether they belong in that community, how that community does or doesn't influence who they are, and what it is that they think they're looking for when they make a claim of somehow being displaced or dispossessed. So I want to insist again that when I think it's dynamic, socially, culturally, and politically constituted, it really matters the context in which you see certain kinds of circles of belonging, and then it becomes important how you understand those circles. Do you imagine these as concentric circles? Do you imagine this as some kind of a Venn diagram? Does it matter which circles you see yourself in, or which circles people put you in? At any moment in time, I am a person with a particular kind of gender assignment or a certain kind of gender claim. I have a certain kind of biology, but I have a certain kind of social role. I have a cultural context, I have a nation that I say I belong to, that citizenship I can choose to change or not or reject. What are the things I can sort of alienate myself from, and what are the things that are not alienable in some sense? All of that matters. At least that's the claim that I want to make. And so when I say here it's only in interaction with others that I actually get to see and know who I am, part of what becomes important is that claim that I was making about whether or not I can get any social support for the identity that I think I'm claiming or projecting. And then what becomes really important is to understand that it's constantly changing. Now, I want to step back from the article that I wrote in 2012 and sort of share with you some of the work by others that I think influences my own work. I want to show you where I think there's overlap with theirs and where I think there's difference. So Mariah Schechtman, in I think this very important book, The Constitution of Selves, actually makes a claim that the important question to be asking about identity is what she frames as the characterization question. And ultimately she's saying that when you're thinking about ethics and morality and things like that, it's not necessarily the sort of traditional question that's important. So, you know, what makes a person at time T2 the same person they were at time T1, which informs a lot of the sort of science fiction about, you know, what happens if we put people in these time machines and they disintegrate and then we rebuild them somewhere else, and we can talk Star Trek or any other kind of thing. Just really, you know, how is that relevant to the important questions that we need to think about? And so she reframes it as what I said is the characterization question. And in that context, this is what she asks. What actions, experiences, beliefs, values, desires, character traits, and so on, and hereafter when I talk about them, I'm going to talk about them the way she does, just generically as characteristics or traits, make a person who she is. And so what she's seeing is this sort of amassing of a number of very important kinds of traits. And I think this is one of the things that actually leads some people to make certain kinds of mistakes around identity when they collapse identity into personality. And personal identity and personality, I think, are different, though in fact one supports or undergirds the other. So she is really, I think, for me anyhow, at least in terms of the work that I'm familiar with in philosophy, one of the first persons to really kind of valorize this notion of narrative identity, and really kind of put a lot of emphasis on saying that there's some kind of control that the person has in forming their autobiographical narrative. So you're going to see right here that obviously I'm in concert with her beliefs when I take on this notion of narrative, but I hope at some point you can already begin to see where we're going to disagree, because I think in her case she's assuming that there's a lot more control over that narrative that rests with the author, if you will, the protagonist, who somehow gets to control their narrative. And I'm not at all convinced that that's true. In fact, I'm going to make the claim that it could not be that way, that we are in fact always co-authors of our own life. And I would go so far as to say that you can take that back to even before you're born. Because before you're born, in utero, somebody is starting to tell stories about you. And that will in fact be there will be amongst those stories some that you will take up and build into your narrative. Oh yeah, it made my mom sick the whole time, you know, blah, 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 or whatever the story's going to be. I was a real kicker, right? And so from very early on, it already shows you that the narrative can start without you in an active sense as a contributor, and that you do have some context because you choose to bring those stories into the story that you will tell as you tell the world who you are. So there's some decision making that's happening, but there's also some contributions that are not part of your lived experience. They are not memories that you have that you then say, oh yes, that's who I am. So the other thing that I think is really important is that when you look at this, it's the claiming that becomes important in terms of the narrative. It's that point at which you make choices as to which threads you're going to weigh in heavily. And so it may be that your narrative is quite complicated and long, but there are certain stories that really become central, right? That you somehow have decided they are definitive, or they mark a particular moment in time, they mark a fork in the road, they influence a particular kind of trajectory. So there is some sense in which you are contributing to the way in which that particular story can and will be told. Right? And other things will be of less importance and may even be discarded to the point that you claim you can't remember them at all. And so one of the things that becomes important then is when other people, in fact, support or contribute to that story and embellish or not. And yet at some time, at some point, you choose to take on those additional thoughts and stories, or you choose to reject them. That's not me. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay? And again, I'm saying a lot of this in very kind of overt ways, and I do not believe that those negotiations are overt in that way. So one of the things then that becomes really important is, so does that mean that I just get to be whoever I say I am and there doesn't have to be any mapping onto the real world? I just am? And Sheckman has an answer for that, and it comes in the context of saying, well, what is an identity constituting narrative? And so I end up taking that language and carrying it through my own work. And she says, for that narrative to be identity constituting, it has to meet two very specific constraints. And the two constraints are the articulation constraint and the reality constraint. The articulation constraint is just that you've got to be able to tell it, right? And so in some sense it becomes important that you be able to say, this is how this story hangs together, here's the story of my life. And one of the things that you'll appreciate when I get to the point about Alzheimer's then is that that's going to come under threat, in some sense, the conceptual claims that are being made in that context, because there will become a point where, in fact, you won't be able to articulate that. Does that just mean you've lost your identity? I'm going to say no. And it's because you don't just have to be able to meet that articulation constraint. So again, I hope already you're seeing that although I'm embracing some of the claims she's making about narrative, and I'm already rejecting the claims that it's only autobiographical, and I'm also already starting to reject the claim that it has to meet this articulation constraint. She then goes on and says it also has to meet the reality constraint, and what that's supposed to mean is that it's got to somehow at least correspond to the real world. And so if I stand before you and I tell you that I'm Napoleon, you would be within your rights to start questioning my narrative, even if I can tell you all the great battles that I have won, etc. Even if I tell you that, no, I really am not 5'7", even though that's what I look like. And no, yes, I really am a man, and can't you see my short stature? And I mean, it doesn't matter how well I can tell that story. At some point, you're just going to say, it's not meeting the reality constraint. Did you know Napoleon is dead? No. How can he be? I'm here. So in some context, you can imagine, and this is like 20 years ago, Mariah's writing against a very dominant understanding and philosophy about what it is that we're looking for, and what it is that we're looking for is to be able to know that the person we've got here in jail, accused of having done a particular crime, really is the same person that 2 years ago was out on the street doing something. We want to know that the person who comes to the door and says, hi, you owe me 20 bucks for the job that I did, you know, shoveling your driveway, really is the person with whom I negotiated the $20 fee, etc. And she, look, those things are all really important, but that's not what we're trying to get at when we're saying, who are you, right? It's a different kind of question that we're asking. And so I think she does really important work in reframing it as characterization, and I think she does really important work in grounding it in a story. And yet I think there are problems with that story. So because I have a lot of words on my slides, every now and then I try to find a picture. And these were a couple of pictures that I tried to get at what I think I'm trying to articulate to this point. There are people that believe that when you think about identity, it's kind of like that old tree that's been cut, and it's all those rings of a life story. But when you get to the middle, it's something solid. That's the core. That's who I am. And then as I've lived my life, you know, there's layers upon layers upon layers, which makes me interesting and complex. But we all know that there's a core me there. And over time, it may come under threat, as you can imagine, injuries to, you know, a great old oak or something like that. And what I'm trying to put out is something that's a lot more fragile, that really does kind of build on this notion of web and interconnectedness. And the difficulty that people have when I put that sort of forward as a metaphor is you're sort of looking, so what are you saying, Françoise? Are you one of the lines? Are you, you know, what are you? And what I'm trying to say is that I'm in that space, right? And all of it's negotiated. And I think that where you can see fragility, you can also see beauty, right? And then if you actually want to talk about things like threat, I think what becomes interesting is what happens when some of those threads break. And how do we then understand what it is that we're holding on to with respect to this notion of personhood? So Mariah Schechtman does this work in the early 90s, and then after that we have this emergence of a number of kinds of claims that I think are really important along the lines of relational theory in general. And Sue Sherwin has written some really important work around the concept of relational autonomy. And one of the things that she does at the time is she contests the dominant notion of autonomy that we have in a Western context, which is of this confident, independent, self-directed, autonomous person. And she says that's just not reality. That is not who we are. We are not these little atoms bouncing about in the world, just kind of doing our own thing with a very narrow understanding of what rational decision making is. And in fact, what we need to see is that we are not these isolated social units. We are in fact deeply embedded in webs of connection, and that when we make decisions, we don't make them as autonomous, selfish, independent beings. We actually make them understanding that we live and work in communities, in families, etc. And in fact, it's quite natural for us to take all of those mixed interests into consideration when we make decisions, and therefore, in fact, it's a claim that much about what we do in bioethics is wrong because the understanding of the person at the center of all of this is wrong. In that context, so we're starting to see lots of people, I want to argue lots of people, I'm taking Sue because she's a colleague of mine as an index kind of case, to sort of say we need to understand the person is rooted in relationships, and I think the minute we understand that, we then understand that their identity is also then negotiated within those relationships. But Sue Sherwin's not the only person who's making that kind of claim. We see this in the work of another philosopher, Lawrence Thomas, again saying we are constituted through others. That is who we are, and the way in which we conceive of ourselves, at least in part, owes much to how others conceive of us. And so again, you see this claim about this inextricable link between self and others. So what happens, I think, is you've got then Mariah Schechtman's work, which I think takes a shift, at least in terms of the literature that I follow, and we move to Hilda Lindemann Nelson's work in 2001. And this is where I think she takes this claim about narrative, but she really does add in this notion of co-authorship. And she really does make reference to these webs of interconnections. And basically, it's not about just how we experience our lives, but how others see and understand us. Okay, and so you can see here that I'm taking up this notion of identity being relational and being somehow negotiated in these kinds of spaces. And so I think it matters that if someone can't see or endorse the person you're claiming to be, if you haven't got that kind of feedback loop, what happens? So I made the claim that you're going to remove yourself from the community in some sense. You're going to go looking for other people who will see you the way you want to be seen. And I have a hypothesis, and I haven't done enough work around this, that if you're not successful in doing that, that in fact that's one of the risks for mental illness. And I say that, you know, as I said, at this point, not having spent enough time thinking about it, but I think if you have that constant discord between who you think you are and absolutely no support for that in any kind of social context, and you're not able to move or change that context, that culture, that environment, that it has to be crazy making, right? At least that's what I think. I don't know how you do an empirical study about that, because I don't know how you instantiate half of what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take you on a trajectory with me to think, if you saw persons in that way, if you understood that you are in part fixing someone else's identity by the way in which you interact with them and the way in which you give them feedback, how might you change the way in which you behave in the world? Both in terms of what you're projecting for others to see and read off of your body, and what it is that you're doing to support other people's sense of self. So one of the things that's interesting in the work that Hilda does is when she's talking about this connective tissue, and I really tried to think about that when I was looking for my metaphor, and I thought, well, how could I get, like, you know, an image of connective tissues? And I really didn't want to have a picture or an image of the brain, you know, with all of these sort of, you know, axons and tentacles and whatever going out. So that's why we ended up with the spider web. But I wanted to think about what that means to talk about connective tissues, because in some sense it's a beautiful metaphor verbally. I couldn't find the right kind of image that I thought. So if anybody has a suggestion afterwards, that would be helpful. But one of the things that she does then, I think, different from Mariah Schechtman's work, is she really says that this narrative is both in the first and the third person. And I think that that becomes really important in terms of how we see that. And then what happens is she has to answer the exact same challenge that comes to Mariah Schechtman. Well, how do you know when you've got authoritative, in some sense, account of personal identity. Now, Mariah Schechtman had the articulation constraint and the reality constraint, and what happens here with Hilda is you have something else. You have the credibility constraint, which she breaks down into 3 criteria. So the reason this becomes important is that she has said that the narratives can be both first and third person, so she then has to allow for the possibility that they might not cohere, right? They might, and then the world is great. But what happens if they aren't? So I tell you who I am, and other people tell you a very different story from that one, and you want to know, well, what's the identity constituting narrative? And Hilda says, well, it's got to have strong explanatory force, by which she means it has to explain some of those characteristics that we see out in the world. It's got to have some kind of correlation to action, so I claim I'm this very kind person, and yet you don't see any behaviors that cohere with that sort of claim about who I am in the world. And then she has this third criterion, which she calls heft. And basically it's the weight that you attach to the salient features in the narrative. And so if you think of people as very complicated beings with lots of different kinds of commitments, character traits, etc., and the weight that is placed on those differs between the first and the third person, again, that can be sufficient for discord because it changes the overall claim or perspective for what you have to bring forward. So what I want to make really clear, because this is where you're going to again see the divergence between the work that's been done by others and where I'm trying to position my own work, is that you've got Schechtman making a claim about narrative and emphasis on autobiographical contributions. You've got Hilda Linden and Nelson, sorry, she's changed her name, and I never know whether you stick with the new name, the old name. Hilda's a good friend of mine. We used to work together at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. So Hilda is going to say it's not just autobiographical, it's first and third person, it's this web of interconnectedness when you're looking for the telling of that story. And then you're going to see the difference when they're looking for what's the identity constituting part of that narrative. And as I said, we've got Schechtman making the reality constraints. You have to have a self-concept that basically is in sync with the view of one that's held by others. And I reject that, and Nelson rejects that. And the reason we reject it is because people can be mistaken about that. And so it really matters that they don't have that final say. They don't have a trump card that says, yes, reality says this is who you are. We don't actually care who you think you are. But the interesting thing, and I think this is what's important, is that if you move to Nelson's understanding, well, just as the person could be wrong about their sense of self, so can others. So in fact, the very same criticism that would be made of Schechtman's theory would apply here. The first person account could be wrong, and the third person account could be wrong. And so even as you go through this, how do you figure out at the end of the day where the trump is going to be? And so what I do in that paper in 2012 is I actually articulate something called the equilibrium constraint. And one of the things that becomes really important when I do that is I think of the equilibrium as being exactly what you would think of as a balance, right? We're trying to get this to sort of sit in a place that's comfortable. It doesn't mean there's 100% agreement, and it especially should not be understood to be a contradiction in that I am not claiming that it's static. And so one of the things that becomes really important with the equilibrium constraint is that it can is constantly at risk of shifting, right? A life event can happen, right? My partner dies. A life event can happen. Although I have tenure, the university gets rid of me. You know, whatever it is, there are things that can shift it and put it out of balance, and I'm going to reconstruct. I'm going to tell a narrative that's going to make sense of what's happening in my life, and so will other people, depending on how I behave. But what I'm arguing is that we're always trying to get ourselves back into that zone, because that's the zone in which we need to live. And so we don't have to have 100% concordance. We do have to have some common sense of what's going on there. And so I talk about that in terms of self-description and description by others, and elsewhere I also talk about it as something that comes out of a series of actions and transactions and reactions, etc. And so I imagine this as this ongoing dynamic exchange. And so the point that becomes important to take out of this is that you're looking for something like stability, but you understand that that is always, always up for transition. And when it's in that kind of phase of transition, you're working really hard to get it back into a sense of sort of reasonable stability. And as I said, I'm using the language of equilibrium. So one of the things I want to say to you is that that's the work that I did theoretically in this one paper that comes out in a book in 2012. At the same time I was writing that theoretical paper is when I was writing the paper on deep brain stimulation. And one of the things that's really interesting, because it just has to do with the publishing game that we all participate in, at the time I actually had a grant specifically on this area, which meant I had money to pay for open access. And so that particular paper goes up online in 2011, doesn't actually come out in print until 2013, and in between those two things, the theoretical piece comes out. But what happens in the I Am Who I Am paper is I really try to take that theoretical work that I've done and say, okay, so if this is my understanding of identity, what does it mean to say that deep brain stimulation is somehow a threat to identity? So I start off in that paper by articulating what I mean by identity so that I'm not at least at fault of having made the same mistake that I accuse other people of. And I talk about identity being created by relational beings that are mutually engaged, and the never-ending project becomes important, right? Because that's where I'm making the claims again that it's not static, and that we need to understand it as a dynamic process of constantly reconstituting ourselves. And I say in the paper that it's in order that we be able to answer, both for ourselves and for the world at large, questions like, who are you? Where are you from? Where are you going? What do you stand for? And that list could go on and on. But that's part of what we mean when we say to somebody, you know, who are you? Right? It's actually a narrative that starts with the who are you and very quickly moves to being able to answer the other kinds of questions. And so the claim that I make in that particular paper is that the work that I'd been reading up until that point, somehow suggesting that deep brain stimulation was a threat to identity, I said was deeply problematic. And in the paper I say it's problematic for a number of reasons, but the thing that I think is really important here is that people that are making that claim, I think, are focusing on the wrong things. And in that context, they're sort of saying, well, look, you're seeing these weird changes in behavior when we turn the stimulation on, or we're seeing changes in mood, we're seeing changes in cognition, and we are changing who that person is. And that seemed like something that we ought not to authorize or ask for consent for or expect somebody to agree with. And one of the first things I do in this paper is to say we ought not to conflate personal identity and personality, and that these things are really important. But what matters is if you think that it's a narrative and it's lasting a lifetime, I can say, if Françoise Baylis is this person who had these experiences, who became depressed, who saw this person, was refractory to other interventions, had deep brain stimulation, it did work, it didn't work, and the story goes on, right? And that is who I am. So in that context, what does it mean to say that deep brain stimulation is a threat to my identity? That can only make sense if you thought that there was some core authentic self and that somehow that's being disrupted by some kind of intervention. The flip side of that is I turn it around and I say, well, why would you think that it's the deep brain stimulation, if there is such a thing as a threat to identity, that represents the threat as contrasted with the underlying illness? Why isn't it that the Parkinson's or the OCD or the tremors are the threat to the identity? If you held on to the view that there is some authentic self, why isn't it the illness that represents the threat? So let me step back and just sort of say, I'm assuming that most of the people in this room understand what the deep brain stimulation involves, but one of the things that I think is really interesting and important, and I do it here too, is that we tend to put up these kinds of images that are very non-threatening in terms of what they represent. And yet if you actually look at some of the surgeries, and I have to look at them in terms of pictures or videos, etc., because I'm not myself a clinician, but it actually looks pretty aggressive when you know, put this little burr hole into somebody's head, and then you're sort of looking down into this tissue, and then you're sort of thinking, oh, I'm going to stick this little, you know, thin needle in, and we're going to have these threads, etc. It doesn't seem as invasive when you see these kinds of pictures as it might be otherwise. And the reason I just want to mention that is because one of the things that I think is worth thinking about with respect to this is whether part of what becomes interesting in terms of this claim of threat is the externality of it, that somehow it isn't organic or it doesn't dissipate through the body in the way, for example, that drugs do, right? And it doesn't necessarily, depending on how it's being offered, have the same kind of control that you might have, for example, around drugs. So I can choose to take the drugs or not take the drugs. I can choose to take too much or too little. And there has been a debate about how much control the patient should have in terms of being able to self-stimulate and whether or not they get to set the parameters or not, etc. And that practice varies from place to place. So one of the things I think that becomes important about that is understanding where it is that people think control should rest. Now, one of the the things that I find interesting is there's a lot in the literature that's very positive with respect to the patient experiences, and this is one of the things that I think is important and overlaps with what Joe Finns was saying earlier, that it's really important to pay attention to what patients have to say and to contribute. And so in that context, this is my effort to give a little bit of voice to them, and I think it's quite interesting the kinds of claims that they make, and I'm obviously pulling out the ones that I think are claims about identity. So saying, if the stimulation is switched off, I am dead. When on, I'm alive. I mean, that's a pretty powerful kind of claim, right, if you were thinking about considering this. I never before had so much energy, neither motor nor intellectual. I rediscovered the joie de vivre, pleasure, laughter. All of a sudden, your hands that have been shaking like crazy all your life are just rock steady. It just changes your life dramatically. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that those seem very dramatic, and they really seem to shift from, I was this kind of person, and with the DBS I became a different kind of person. So you could think about this as sort of not a threat to identity, but allowing you to have control or reclaim an identity that perhaps you thought was lost, or a brand new identity that you get to hold on to. Just a few more quotes, again, because I think that there's one here that I thought was particularly interesting, which is the first of them. It was literally like a switch being turned on that had been held down for years. All of a sudden they hit the spot, and I feel so calm and so peaceful. It was overwhelming to be able to process emotion on somebody's face. I'd been numb to that for so long. Thanks to these doctors, I now have my life back. The pain, fear, anxiety, and depression are pretty much completely gone. And I'm now very happy, healthy, working, active, fulfilled, a grateful individual. One of the things that I think is really interesting is several of these comments actually come from Medtronics. They have an ambassadors program. And so I found that really interesting when I stumbled onto that. I thought, wow, what an interesting concept, an ambassadors program for, you know, a DBS intervention. And I started thinking, can I find those for other things? Like, is there an ambassadors program for Prozac? You know, I didn't find those things, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is then I had to go looking to say it can't all be this happy story, right? There have to be a few kinds of stories that are less interesting from that point of view. So I did go looking for some of those. And here you see something that's quite different. I had severe mental fogginess, trouble reading, concentrating, focusing, doing my job, tasks I'd done before almost in my sleep. I had to apply for disability. So the idea here that the intervention is in fact taking you in the opposite direction, it's not so much that you're doing better, you're doing much worse. All hell broke loose with me. It hit me like a Mack truck. I was working from home doing a conference call and the rage just popped. Somebody said something stupid and I felt like I was going to murder someone. For the next 6 months, that cycle repeated. I'd go in for programming, they'd change the DBS settings. Within 24 hours, a new Richard emerged. Apathetic Richard, manic Richard, suicidal Richard, homicidal Richard. Who knows what kind of Richard would appear after these sessions? So one of the things that's interesting is when the patient makes the claim a new Richard, is that a new identity, or is that a new phase, or is that just a new place of being in the world? And the interesting thing that I'm going to point to is that regardless of the adjective being used, it's still Richard, right? It's not, well, Richard popped up and Mary popped up and then there was David, right? There's this sense of the I that's still there, but the behaviors. So one of the things that then becomes interesting is it the loss of control then that becomes the threat to identity if you're using that language? It's that Richard can't decide if he's going to be the apathetic Richard or the homicidal Richard or the happy Richard? Is that what's of concern? Just want to share then a few more thoughts that go in that sort of direction. I'd had night tremors and catatonic sleep like narcolepsy. It would just come over me in the middle of the day, and I'd have 20 minutes to get somewhere safe before it took over and knocked me out. And the point that it took over, what's taking over? My wife couldn't even wake me up. That happened 4 or 5 times a week. So again, one of the things that's interesting here is the sense that I'm losing control. And one of the things that's interesting about identity are assumptions we make about control. And yet I would call that into question. I don't know that we have control over our identity in some sense. One of the other things that I thought was particularly interesting, and I put this in here because I wanted us to think about it in terms of identity, it says, This is work done by a colleague, used to be a postdoc of mine, Frédéric Gilbert. He did a review of 4 studies and came to publish the claim that in these 4 studies, between 9 and nearly 12% of the trial participants ultimately attempted suicide, and the same percentage of patients committed suicide. Apparently, that's a 3- to 4-fold increase of the best estimates for suicide amongst persons with severe depression. So the claim that's being made there is that somehow the DBS exacerbated what might have been there elsewhere, or otherwise, sorry. The bottom line is, I don't really want to make a claim about overall whether or not DBS is positive or negative. The claim I want to make is that what matters is the patient perspective, and that some will see it as very positive, some will see it as very negative. That if you think that there is an authentic true self, then one of the interesting things is who gets to decide whether the change that you either see as positive or negative was threatening, or whether it's just a new self emerging, etc. And the mere fact that you can bring that kind of valuation to it, to me, suggests something very different than that there is some kind of authentic self that you either are getting back to or being taken away from. The interesting thing is that overall, I chose to sort of highlight things that I thought made sense in the context of making sort of philosophical claims about a sense of self. But overall, when I look at the literature and you look at the claims about what's positive and negative, many of them are actually more biological than they are these sort of esoteric kinds of claims. So typically, it gets presented as a positive intervention if the tremors are gone, if the depreciation's alleviated, if you've got, increased motivation. That gets called a successful treatment. The successful treatments typically are not claims about identity, right? It's not like you've got yourself back, whatever that might mean. And the negative changes basically are changes that you just don't want. So, you could end up with some kind of speech dysfunction, which seems to be common amongst some people, reduced working memory, etc. Again, people aren't often going to make the claims in terms of identity. And the reason I say that is that I think if you read through those narratives, you can find those claims, but that's not typically where the patient themselves puts the emphasis. And in support of that, I want to share this work by Helmut Dubiel, which is about a claim deep in the brain. He's an academic that I met in Freiburg at a conference, who was one of the early people to have deep brain stimulation. And one of the things I'm going to show when I talk to you about his narrative is that when he talks about the things that are ultimately, from his perspective, harmful, so he was not all that pleased with some of the side effects for the deep brain stimulation, he identifies exactly the kinds of things that I've just said that are basically biological in terms of its effect on his ability to walk, to talk, to control the tremors, etc. And I want to say that I think that actually what was going on there has actually so much more to do with identity. And what I find interesting is that, am I just imposing what I want to see on that in terms of how I choose to read it, and don't I give over to the person's own autobiographical narrative in terms of what their claims are? So Helmut and I were both speakers at a conference. His presentation was in German. I don't speak German. So I couldn't understand anything that he said, but I really wanted to speak with him. And so afterwards, because I knew that he was bilingual, I'm bilingual as well, but not with German, I asked if we could go out for a coffee, which we did. So we were sitting in a coffee shop, and I was asking him a whole bunch of questions, telling him that my work was on issues of identity, and I really wanted to understand his perspectives on that. And at some point in the conversation, he needed to stimulate himself in order to be able to continue talking, and so out comes this little device, and surreptitiously puts it under his jacket, and he stimulates himself, and then it goes back. It was all very subtle and clearly very practiced, right, in a way that this could be done without drawing attention. But because I was there to have a conversation with him specifically about questions of identity, I said to him, so what if, instead of having to do what you just did, we could actually implant a very small device in your wrist, so that when you needed to stimulate yourself, all you'd have to do is sort of go like this and subtly just push down on your wrist. Nobody need know. It wouldn't become overt to the world in some way, shape, or form that you were sort of self-stimulating. And his response, quick as a whip, was, oh no, I wouldn't want that. And I said, well, why not? Wouldn't that be great? He said, no, then I'd be like a machine. And I sat there and I thought, wow. That would make you a machine, that somehow the device which you are controlling is embedded in your body rather than external to you. And I think it's really worth thinking about. Now, I don't know how many people would share that view, But one of the things that becomes interesting is that there was for him an outside marker to the world of control, right? And that's why one of the things that I'm very interested in around the DBS is whether ultimately the threat to identity, if one grants that language, isn't about the intervention per se, but the who's having the control, right, of that intervention. And I think what's concerning to some people is that it might be your doctor, or some other person who might be not your very nice doctor, but some other kind of awful doctor. Anyhow, having said all of that, what I want to do is, in the time that I have, is actually take you through a book in a very, very short space, which is why you're seeing the references there. These are not my words. I am really allowing Helmut to speak for himself in terms of telling his story. What I have done is I've taken some control in terms of choice around the excerpts and the narrative that I'm trying to pull out or retell. So I'm not going to do complete karaoke in terms of reading these slides for you, but every now and then I want to try and place a particular emphasis. The point of these excerpts is to tell you that at the time of diagnosis he sees himself as a very successful person in the academy, and he sees himself, I think, as on the cusp of becoming even more successful, right? He is the crown prince. One of the things that I think is interesting is what he says in the second bullet there. He says, but once I received the diagnosis, a gradual process of alienation arose between the Institute and me. Okay, so one of the things that I want you to hold on to is, what does that mean, that there's this process of alienation? When somebody comes and tells you they have an illness, why would that start a process of alienation? Does it matter what illness it is that you're identifying? Is it at the moment in time, the diagnosis that's worrisome? Or is it the trajectory that people anticipate? And what is it that happens in terms of that response, in terms of how your own sense of self and your identity will continue to evolve? A year later, when he's talking about this, he says, I changed radically. Now what's interesting is that he's claiming that this change doesn't have anything to do specifically with the brain physiology, but it has to do with his psychological adjustments to his body, and the fact that he feels like he's losing a certain amount of control over his body. And so one of the things that I think is really important, and it is part of the work that I do around the issue of identity, is how much the body matters, and our sense of, being well in our bodies and being able to control our bodies and allowing that our bodies project something. And he was very distressed by the fact that he was losing control over his body. But notice again the language. So previously at the beginning, with the diagnosis, he feels alienated, and now a year later he's claiming he's estranged from his colleagues. So the thing that I think is important, and the reason I'm choosing these excerpts, is he is telling us that his sense of belonging and his relationships are starting to break down in some way, shape, or form. You're also, however, getting the more traditional kinds of claims. By early afternoon, my hands are shaking, etc., and he's having trouble doing the kinds of things that are important. And one of the things that was really important is that he's a professor. He's got to be able to write. He's got to be able to sit up and stand. He's got to be able to stand or sit and lecture. And the things that are under threat now are very much a threat to his sense of self. How do you hold on to yourself as a successful academic when you can't do the things that successful academics do? One of the things that was really interesting to me when I had those personal conversations with him is at one point in the conversation, he actually said with some sadness, I will be more remembered for this book than I will be remembered for all of the academic contributions that I've made in my own discipline. And I thought that that was really interesting, because I don't know that I would have had that insight or thought about it but for him articulating it. And what I thought was very interesting is that he was sad about that. That basically the telling of his story around how he negotiated his illness was going to be what the world would remember him for. He then talks at another stage of the illness about the Parkinson's being full-blown, and he talks about this. He says, it robs a person of the ability to continually reinvent himself. And I think that that, for me, is particularly telling, because he's using a language that's different from the one I would use, but I think that that's exactly what we do. We are constantly reinventing ourselves as we take our life experience and we build that into our narrative. And we choose to either weigh something very heavily in the telling of that narrative, it changed who I am. And notice that when I say that, I think that's a rhetorical device when people say, it changed who I am. It didn't. You just are continuing to evolve. And between yourself and others, you're continuing to negotiate who you are and how you're going to be in the world. But I think this is very powerful. He says, one's life becomes similar to that of a plant. Right? I mean, that's really quite devastating to think of yourself in that way, because although a plant is not an inanimate object, it doesn't have one of the things that we think is really valuable about humans, right? Which is our cognitive capacities, right? So to imagine yourself as a being without that, and clearly then you would experience that as a threat to autonomy. Now, what's going to be really important is I don't think a threat to autonomy is the same kind of thing as a threat to identity. And I do understand threats to autonomy, and I do believe that illnesses such as Parkinson's, OCD, etc., could be threats to autonomy in some way, shape, or form. And I also believe that certain kinds of treatments and interventions could also be threats to autonomy. So the DBS could be a threat to autonomy. But threats to agency are not threats to identity. At least that's what I want to claim. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that he's able to articulate in the book perspectives other than his own, and he claims that from a medical perspective, he was a success. Right? And why is he a success? Because the tremors are controlled, because he can reduce the medications, etc. But having offered the medical perspective, he then turns around and also offers a personal perspective. And again, I think it's really quite powerful. In my case, the operation had merely replaced the plague with cholera. Doesn't sound like much of a success from that point of view, right? And yet he's willing to say, but look, I have to admit, yes, you know, in general, my tremors, the dyskinesias, etc., they were gone. And that would be understood as a success. What's interesting is that when he actually elaborates intentionally, meaning he himself says what went wrong, he said the worst side effects of the DBS was that my volume is too low, my articulation is poor and slurred, my speech is soft and washed out. If you're a university professor and you can't stand up and be, you know, loud and bombastic when you want to be, you know, subtle and quiet when you need to be, when you feel you haven't got control, and when you're worried that as you're giving your lecture, you're slowly going to lose your voice, it is, in some sense, really deeply troubling. But notice he doesn't say, at least here, that I'm worried about my identity. What he says is I'm worried about these practical things. And I want to make the claim immediately, well, all of those practical things that you're worried about is because ultimately they will have an effect on who you are, how you can see yourself, and how you can project yourself to the world. One of the things he talked about a lot was that he can't talk while he walks, right? And that's something that we hear often. But what I did when I go back and I look through his book, because when I met and chatted with him, the book was not yet available in English. And so I had a certain kind of sense and notes that I'd taken from those conversations, and then was able to go back and read the book when it came out in English. And yet, when I looked at what I thought were the worst side effects, they're there in the book to be seen. They're not where he placed the emphasis, but they're where I found the emphasis. He's estranged from his colleagues. His life is similar to that of a plant. He's replaced the plague with cholera. I walk through the streets and I count the oncoming pedestrians who look at my asymmetrical shuffling gait with curiosity or alienation. These are all things that are about relationships and place in the world. So is DBS a threat to identity? At the end of the day, I don't think so. I don't think that the DBS is any more a threat to the identity than is, say, the Parkinson's in his case, or any other kind of underlying illness for which you would offer DBS as a treatment. Both of them, the underlying illness and the offered treatment, can certainly have an impact on personality, but that's what your identity is made up of. It's made up of the personality traits that you have and that you're able to project. That doesn't mean that's what it collapses down to. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is I think that we conflate those two, and then the interesting thing becomes, well, what more is there then when you're talking about personal identity as contrasted with personality? And very much, my answer is going to be, well, it's all the other things that I've just talked about in that web of relations. So my personality is then negotiated and mitigated in terms of how people respond to that. They either like it or they don't. I either choose to respond and say, you know, yeah, well, that's just who I am. And if they don't like it, who cares? They just don't have to be part of my circle of belonging. Or ultimately, they are important to me, and I do change and respond and react. So the point that I want to make is that the I is ever present in all of the, or not all, in most of these patients. And this is results from a study. I don't have the reference here. It's Schupbach, and it's an article in Neurology from about 10 years ago. And in this particular case, it's neurosurgery in Parkinson's, patients with Parkinson's disease, and he's saying that 66% report a feeling of strangeness and unfamiliarity. But the point I'm wanting to make there is they're saying, I don't feel like myself. So you have a sense of self somewhere in there, right? I haven't found myself after the operation. So that's kind of this claim that there's this authentic self to be found. And yet what I think is more interesting is the 20% that are concerned not so much about the change, but the mechanism of the change. And so here the emphasis is, I feel like a robot, I feel like an electrical doll, right? And so the concern there is that somehow there's an externality to the control. And yet one of the things that's interesting for me is that I think that that externality was always there in the context of narrative identity. It's just there's this sort of dichotomous way of seeing it here, right? There's a me that's under threat, or there's some others who out there are in fact controlling who or what I can be. I think the interesting thing then is when people use that language, is it that they're worried about the fact that there's some artificial stimulation happening? Is it that they're worried about the fact that it's the placement of the electrodes can make such a difference in terms of what is being stimulated, or how high the voltage is, or who gets to determine what those parameters are, etc.? In the little bit of time that's left, I want to shift and just talk a little bit about the more recent work. So this work, both of the things I've been talking about are largely in print. They've been misunderstood, which is why I'm always pleased when I have an opportunity to sort of say them myself a little bit. And largely it's because, as I said, for some people I think it's really hard to get their head wrapped around the idea that I don't control my identity, that my identity is not in my body or my brain, and that it's a constant set of negotiations and it is a life story. There can be radical ruptures in an identity. You can have a traumatic event that has huge impact on your personality, etc. But I'm saying you're still you, right? Just things have happened to you. And your way of navigating the world changes accordingly. But the most recent work I've been doing is around the notion of Alzheimer's, and one of the things that I think is really difficult for us to think about there is the focus in terms of what I want to say now is not about some kind of external intervention that's perceived as a threat, but rather the illness itself, which is perceived as a threat, because over time you're losing your memories. And one of the things that's important is, how can I tell my story if I can't hold on to my memories? And what happens with Alzheimer's, as the area, I'm not able to make new memories, so is it the certain life story, life trajectory that stops? And then what happens when the emphasis starts shifting to a much earlier point in my life? So what is happening to the person and to any kind of claims about identity? Well, basically, I'm holding on in this new work to what I think are some of the core elements, right? That personal identity is dynamic, so it's constantly changing, so the fact that you have this illness is just something that's going to get incorporated into your narrative. It's thoroughly relational, and so again, your relationship with other people who are aware of and understand the illness and are going to choose to interact with you in a particular way or not are going to affect the continuing dynamic development of that. And one of the things that's important with this illness is both how it gets negotiated in intimate and public spaces. And although I made those claims before, I think they become more dramatic in terms of my own understanding of them, because one of the things that happens with Alzheimer's, dementia, and other kinds of threats to memory is that the public spaces become more and more limited, and the friends fall away, the colleagues fall away, in ways that they don't necessarily do in other illnesses, right, where you're still intimately interacting with others, right? You can have OCD, depression, etc., and still work out in the world, whereas with Alzheimer's, over time, you ultimately become institutionalized, and as you become institutionalized, your circle diminishes dramatically. And there's very interesting work on what happens when people become institutionalized at the very same stage of illness, and how the trajectory in terms of personhood changes dramatically. But I'm holding on to the idea that the person creates her identity-conferring story over time in concert with others. And so now the problem I have to address with Alzheimer's is what happens to the in concert with others when you're less and less able to be a contributor to that autobiographical account. And one of the claims I'm going to make is that ultimately, as you recede, other people have responsibilities to take up, and then they either do or they don't. And it becomes then quite interesting in terms of how one understands that. So again, what I'm asking quite dramatically here, and I think of it as dramatic partly because I'm living it, is what does it mean to contribute to an identity-constituting narrative of someone who's slowly losing her mind, and thereby losing some of the key capacities on which relationships are formed and relied on, right? It matters in that context that my mom knows when she's talking to me that she's talking to her daughter as opposed to a stranger. And then yet I have to ask myself the question, and I do later on in this work, really? Does it really matter? Or does it just matter that she knows somebody who cares about her is there? And ultimately, if she doesn't even know that, does it just matter that it's somebody who's smiling and is friendly? Doesn't know if there's any kind of connection. So one of the things that becomes really important is to actually make decisions about what is it that matters in terms of relationships when memory is at stake. And one of the things that I think becomes really important is recognizing that with the illness of Alzheimer's, and certainly this was my own experience, we have illusions, or maybe they're not illusions because they turn out to be true for some people. We have ideas about what this illness is, and I know in my own case, I just imagined once we had the diagnosis that my mother would become this nice little gentle lady sitting in a corner who would slowly lose her mind. And that's not how it played out in this case, and my mother became extremely aggressive to the point that she was ultimately removed from the home by the police. And it's really devastating to experience that, and so what happened? Did my mom change? Did she lose certain inhibitions and return to a self that some of us had never seen? What was going on there in terms of claims that might or could be made about identity? And I think one of the things that's important then is that what matters is not an event, but a response, and a response over time, and how is it that that gets understood. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting in some of the work that I've looked at is what does it mean to talk about the mind or the self as disobedient? I mean, I think that's a really interesting claim. So if somebody becomes a person that we say at first we don't recognize, what is it that's happened? Is it that the person is still there and somehow overwhelmed by an illness? That would take you back to this notion of authenticity. What happens when they lose skills that you think of as germane to any human being, and yet maybe perhaps particularly to this person in front of you? So I guess the question I'm asking is, what does it mean to be constituted in and through personal relationships? And up until this point, in terms of some of the earlier work, the emphasis had been on this ability to have this kind of negotiated, dynamic sense of self. And when I began to look at those sort of theoretical claims with respect to Alzheimer's, I began to look narrowly, or more narrowly, I would say, at the question of memory, and that took me to questions about belonging and recognition. And so one of the interesting things then in that context is, how do you do co-authoring if you don't have memory? If you can't hold on to what was the story you were participating in, and if you haven't got memories that you can solidify to continue the narrative. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about belonging is it's sort of a term that can be thought of bidirectionally. Meaning, I can make a claim of belonging and have it be rejected, or I can make no claims of belonging and other people can claim me. And one of the things that I think that happens with Alzheimer's is that you see a shift in that direction. And so this concept, which could otherwise be bidirectional, right? I claim to belong to this family, to this community, to this world, is something that I'm able to assert at some point. Whether it's a good assertion or not is irrelevant, but I have that ability. And ultimately my claim is that as you lose that, other people get to pick it up. And the interesting thing is some will and some won't, right? And so one of the things that I think becomes really important is, what if nobody picks it up? What if you don't belong to anybody? And then what happens when you end up in a home in isolation? Now, ultimately, I don't think you can ever lose everybody, and the reason for that is that you're still recognized as part of the human community, and so you've at least got that sense of belonging. But I think what can become threatening is when you're no longer sure that that will be there. So basically, one of the things that I think is really important is, what does it mean to participate in relationships of belonging, and what happens when those are no longer under your control? And I think the thing that's happening then is the authorial voice is shifting. And then if I can, in terms of recognition, what I want to say there is that part of what happens with the notion of recognition is, again, it starts off as a concept that's about me recognizing myself and being recognized by others, comes later on, and yet what happens with Alzheimer's is ultimately there might only be the recognition by others. Right? And so one of the things that's been particularly interesting to me in the context of thinking about this is how many times, and this is work that obviously other people have experienced as well, and I met Janelle Taylor for the first time, but what's interesting is that we've both had the same experience. A lot of emphasis gets put on, does she recognize you? And one of the things that I think is interesting is that both of us want to turn that around and say, and why does that matter? Isn't the question that matters, do I still recognize her? And one of the things that's been very fascinating to me in that context is how often not only do people ask that particular question, they go a step further and they say, it doesn't matter that she doesn't recognize you, she's already gone. That's not your mother, right? And one of the things that's really important about that kind of claim is that when you say that, it's offered in the context of, I guess you would think that as support and kindness, and you shouldn't be worried that, this person who's aggressive, that's not your real mother. This person who's doing these other strange behaviors, that's not your real mother. And the response has to be, I think, and ought to be, well, if she's not my real mother, why am I hurt by it, right? Like, if she's just some demented lady sitting out there screaming and yelling at me, it doesn't have any impact on me. It's just, somebody that's unfortunate. So the reason it has any kind of emotional impact is because, in fact, she is my mother, right? And in that context, what becomes important is to understand that the identity claim now is all about me in the relationship to my mother, but the point is, with respect to all Alzheimer's patients, everything rests with somebody else. And if you don't claim that person's identity for them, then that's the point at which I think they do get lost to the world, because nobody is recognizing them for who they are and where they belong. And the fact that they've lost their memory is not within their control. What is, however, within the control of others is the belonging and the recognition. And so if I can, I think where I'm going with that ultimately is to try to say that recognition is about living in the company of others, and that matters in the context of identity, because I've said that identity is something that rests in the context of others. So one of the things then that becomes really important with this particular illness, and the way in which I think is enriching my understanding of identity, is that it allows me to hold on to the narrative, it allows me to hold on to the relationality, it allows me to hold on to the dynamic nature of this, and what it forces me to do is to understand that there's that equilibrium that I talked about, which I had some confidence in earlier, also shifts. And maybe that equilibrium doesn't actually work like the scales of a balance, where I sort of thought the equilibrium just kind of was like this. Maybe it can't be like this and still be an equilibrium. Okay? And that's the interesting thing that I'm working with now as a concept, to figure out how is that we understand the equilibrium constraint, because I don't want to give that up, because I do think that that's in part still important. But what matters is understanding how that shift has happened. So I'm just going to share work that I didn't know about till a couple of days ago. And I think it's really important, and it's work by Paul Ricard, that recognition starts off as identification, and what you're seeing is it moves over finally from self-recognition to recognition by others. It moves from the active to the passive, it moves from the cognitive and intellectual onto the ethical and the political, and ultimately what it's about is recognition by others. And ultimately what I want to say is that identity is always about recognition by others, and what happens is we get to see that much more dramatically when somebody has something like Alzheimer's. So let me just end there. This is some of the work on which that is drawn. These are some of the publications over time. And the work that you just heard about is hopefully forthcoming this year, where really, as I said, I'm trying to take some of those basic understandings and push them out further. So I've kept you from lunch. I'm sorry about that, but thank you for your patience.
Thank you. And now we have Dr. Andrew Coe to give some comments, and then if you want to say anything after his comments, that's fine, and we'll open it up for discussion with the rest of the audience.
Should I sit here or back?
Yeah, no, there's fine. That's great.
Thanks. I just wanted to express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here. It's been a little while since I've attended any sort of philosophical lectures. First, I would like to, and I didn't prepare a PowerPoint like Karen did, so I feel a little bad about that.
Turn it to black screen and then it'll be okay.
Okay. Or I'm going to close that.
It won't turn off that way.
All right, well,
There's a thing up here.
so it's funny that everybody sort of mentioned rules of three, because neurosurgery has rules of three too. So if somebody asks me, how do you do a temporal lobectomy? Okay, well, there's 3 steps, and each step has 3 steps. So you start with an opening, you do the resection, you do the closure. The opening has 3 steps: it's soft tissue, bone, dura. So all rules of 3 are a good thing, I think. In terms of commenting on this, I was a philosophy major as an undergrad, which is an increasingly long time away. Which that was a great moment yesterday. I was like, how long ago did I read this? Okay. But so I had sort of three groups of things I wanted to say. First was just my reactions to this type of identity theory, which, again, back when I was doing this was basically like Parfit and Ayers and stuff like that, which significantly different. Just some of my experiences from the clinical realm with regard to this type of question, and then some of the questions I had, which actually were sort of addressed at the end of the talk anyway. But sort of to start, my favorite philosophers were like Hume, Peirce, and Foucault. And I think all three of them actually sort of had this instrumentalist bent, which, Hume was very much like, I called him a pragmatist, and my professors would get really upset, like, no, he's totally different. But he is. He was like, these ethical things that you should think about depend on the context that you're in, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And these are, I was like, okay, how is that not pragmatism? And then Peirce was, the On Fixation of Belief is one of my favorite essays ever. Basically, I think also it has that sort of emphasis on relationships between people and how that plays into whether or not you can consider something true. And then Foucault is like, how can any of this make sense when all of it's changing? Because, okay, these are the criteria for knowledge that are underlying all of that, and again, those are relational. And so I just thought I enjoyed the talk. I enjoyed reading the stuff that was sort of the background reading for this. But it sort of speaks to this tension that's always there between sort of the little t truth and the big T truth, or little s self, big s self, however you want to classify it, just in terms of, there are these things that we sort of consider to be true because they're going to be useful, and then in a different context you're going to have to rethink that. And again, just sort of in my experiences with this, doing stuff in the real world, or whatever you want to call it, I think that's pretty useful, and we sort of need to keep that in mind. I do like the notion that the self, once you expand it outside the individual, that you have to start taking into account politics and agenda and what people, as they're defining identity, what are they trying to do? And again, that I think even when you're doing stuff where you're not explicitly taking that into account, plays a big role. So sort of to get to that, just a couple of patients that I was thinking of while doing this. One is somebody I implanted DBS in for Parkinson's, who actually a really interesting guy, and I didn't get HIPAA clearance to use his name, so I won't. But he was a professor at the UW. He trying to balance giving too much information because then it'll be obvious who he is. But he never took medications, and so there's a sort of a personal reason for this that was intimately tied up with his identity. And he really needed to. Talking to him, and he sort of admits this in retrospect, sort of, but as the symptoms got worse, he was able to control a lot of them with exercise and things like that, which, that's great if you can manage to do that. But he has these pre-operative videos of himself that he had his family take, where he, would be walking, and you see him get to a door, and he'd stop, and he'd freeze, and he couldn't move. And it's pretty just classic freezing of gait that levodopa would have fixed. But he wasn't willing to tolerate the side effects and how he thought of himself. And it really did, how he thought of himself really did impact his outcome in that regard. So eventually, after about 15 years, when he started, he couldn't lecture anymore, he couldn't travel, he couldn't do all these things that he did kind of think of as his identity, he started thinking about DBS. And so I eventually had several conversations with him. He had it implanted. It went great, which thank God, because he knows everybody I work with. And one of the things that he said afterwards, one of the things that his wife said is like, oh, it's like we had the old blank back. And he had not had a birthday party. He used to have a birthday party every year, invite all the people, and for like 10 years he hadn't done this. He had one, he invited me, embarrassed me a lot. But I just thought it was an interesting thing that this sort of did impact his identity. So that was one of the good things. And it's funny because his, with respect to his particular treatment, his speech is a lot worse when he has his DBS cranked up to where his tremor's gone. So thought it was interesting listening to Dr. Dubiel's story about how, you know, having that speech go away was really bad for him. My patient was like, speech, it's worse. It's okay though, because I can actually get to the conference and give the talk. And people put up with a little bit of dysarthria, but it's worth the trade. So I thought that was interesting. It's also interesting, like if you look at, there isn't a ton of literature in the neurosurgery, well, not a ton of neurosurgical literature talking about side effects and what people think about that in that way. I mean, there's lots of papers on side effects, but like 60% of people have them. If you look at whether or not they would trade them, almost 100% say, okay, well, it's fine. It's a trade I make for the benefit. What's interesting is when it doesn't work. So I have another patient who I thought had essential tremor. Went through a workup, had him see a neurologist who confirmed it, implanted the leads. He didn't get better at all, and instead had this slew of other issues, none of which were actually medically serious, but all had to do with, you know, I don't like this, I feel the wire pulling, this really hurts, and there were, in retrospect, sort of clear signs that this was probably going to happen. He's, not blaming the patient for a bad outcome, but it was more just, you know, I should have thought that this might not be the case, and I think in the end he has a psychogenic tremor. I mean, last time I saw him in clinic, I had him hold his arms out, started talking to him about having him do something with his other hand, and that tremor went away. It's like, so me, 2 neurologists, we just didn't get it, because his story otherwise fit perfectly. So his case, that kind of made me think, like, how often are we doing surgery here to try to treat people's identity issues? And so just going to a totally different field, if you think about spine surgery, we do a lot of fusions, a lot of decompressions on people's backs, and generally it's, especially for degenerative changes, you're operating on people who are overweight, they have diabetes, they smoke, but they have pain and you want to help them, so you do an operation on your back, and none of their underlying behavior changes. So you see them again in 2-3 years with the same problems. What are we trying to do with this surgery? And, you know, do we need to sort of take that into consideration? Because within our narrow view, which is necessary to get things done, we're kind of barking up the wrong tree. So that's kind of, I think, an interesting point that this sort of conception of identity should raise, which, again, I have no idea how practical that would be, but I think it's something to think about. And the last thing, again, given my career as a neurosurgeon, I see a lot of folks who, again, are going to be in the situation where if somebody isn't recognizing them as a person, what are they going to do? And so here I'm thinking of a lot of the pediatric neurosurgery population where they're never going to take care of themselves. What happens when their parents are gone? Alzheimer's is another example. It's a little bit less troublesome to me, I think, because at least they've had sort of the experience of having an identity rather than so much of their identity being wrapped up in somebody else just from the start. And so those are just some of the questions that this sort of raises, is, you know, how does that help us try to address these issues, which, again, I don't have any answers for, but it is just, it's good to think about, because usually I don't. So anyway, thanks.
I think I'd just like to offer one comment, because I think one of the things that you illustrated, I think really well, is how much the issue of control matters in the context of identity. And that's because although I've tried to describe this as sort of this negotiated space, we do try to assert control over it. We want to be seen in a particular kind of way, and we do certain kinds of things in that. But I also, there was something you said that I thought triggered a thought or a memory from one of the cases that we had where there was deep brain stimulation for pain control. And one of the things that was very interesting is that the patient turned it off. It was actually working to control the pain, but there was a whole identity wrapped up in being the person with this extreme level of pain that people then responded and reacted to her and supported that particular kind of identity. And she actually lost that when she was this well-functioning, healthy person in the world. And I think that that's a really interesting kind of thing, but it talks about, again, the relational aspect of that identity, that it was actually not pleasant to be helpful, to be healthy and well, because there was so much, vested in this other kind of identity and didn't want to give it up. So the deep brain stimulation had worked perfectly from the sort of, biological, physiological point of view. It was a success, yet in terms of a life story, it wasn't. And so the other thing that I think, again, for me is really interesting is all the spaces and times at which we want control. So you described a patient who, is in fact, part of that identity is being able to exert control and say, no, I know who I am, and I don't need drugs, and I don't need this. And yet, when they do finally make that decision, for me, there's a consistency there because I'm still exerting control. It's just I've reached a different stage in my thinking about it, and so I'm still the person who needs to control my environment, and now I'm controlling it in this other way. The other one comment I want to make is this claim that, we've got the old person back. And we hear that a lot. And I guess my response to that is I think we need to understand that as a rhetorical device. That what we're saying is we have a person that we now recognize again because it's a person we were familiar with. But to me, that isn't that ultimately shouldn't be understood as sort of they lost their identity and they're getting it back. Their identity is the person who behaved in this way, who for a period of X number of years behaved in a different way, who through an intervention now behaves in a way that we recognize again, or what have you. But it really is to say we do ourselves a disservice by sort of saying, well, for 10 years we don't know who was there. I don't know, Charlie, was that you? Who were you? Because now we've got the real Charlie back. So who was there in the interim, right? And my point is, no, we really need to hold on to that sort of claim that it's the whole life story that makes up the identity. Because the person that you see in front of you today is the person that had those however many years of behaving in a different way. And that influences how they see themselves today and how they will interact the same or differently today. So thank you very much for your comments. Appreciate those.
So questions from the audience?
Hello. It's so nice to finally meet you. I've read your paper a lot of times, and I have to say, in a very public way, that it's what got me interested in DBS in the first place. Besides Aaron here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. So I had a question about this idea that self-narrative has constraints. And I was wondering, well, you were guiding us through different ways of conceiving of that kind of constraint, like you've got your credibility criteria, and it all comes down to you can't just say whatever you want about yourself, right? But I was wondering, what other than, who else do we push against when we try to navigate? Oh.
You have to really speak up.
There are no constraints out there.
Yeah, no constraints out there. It's discovery days out there, so they're playing with robots and things. Oh, so it's pretty awesome. So I was wondering, who gets to sit at the table when you're trying to negotiate your narratives? So you're thinking of situations where a person says they are who they think they are, but other people will say, well, you don't just get to say that. But is it possible that there are other agents in that process that aren't human, right? So I'm thinking about the relationship that we have with devices, not just the relationships we have with people. So is it the case that at some point, or does it make sense to say that at some point you're negotiating with an algorithm on a deep brain stimulation device or an external system like a BCI device and its mode of control? Does that make sense, or am I saying something strange?
No, I think it's actually quite interesting. If I'm looking perplexed, it's because I'm actually thinking. I mean, I think that's actually really interesting, because I think what you're getting at is this idea that I've been struggling with around the issue. At the end of the day, is the real issue one of control and the perception of where the control is, and that it's very difficult to give up control, right? So I think one of the reasons people have difficulty accepting the kind of account of identity I'm trying to give is because they do imagine that they actually have control over it. And I'm actually asking them to believe that you don't have control. You try to exert it, that I don't disagree with. But at the end of the day, you don't have ultimate control because there are so many other people around there that ultimately have a kind of defining impact on whatever narrative you're going to be able to hold. And so what you're asking is, could you find yourself in a situation where in fact you willfully give up a certain amount of that control, which then ultimately means that maybe there are parts of it that aren't up for negotiation anymore. So if you totally I mean, in a science fiction kind of context, you know, were to give over to either a machine or another human controlling a machine that's part of an internal device which actually is going to direct you in some way, shape, or form, I think the idea then that becomes interesting to me is can we have, or can we imagine, Ulysses-type contracts where in fact we've given over a certain amount of the self-control and the person who would be contributing to the narrative. So I think it's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about it before. I think my ultimate response would be to say, you never have had complete control, but that's an illusion. That ultimately there are many other people that are contributing different levels of control at all times, right? Like even the president of my university affects who I am and can be within my institution for a variety of reasons that have to do with how he interacts with me or what kinds of policies he sets and how I engage. And I think what you're asking me to contemplate is, could it go beyond humans to actually giving over something willfully? I think the point that we're at right now is that it would still entail a step of the giving over. But could you do that in the abstract? I would think yes.
We're clearly dealing with control issues on the outside. My apologies. I'll just encourage everybody to speak up when you ask questions. Yeah. Go ahead.
Cool. So feel free to clarify if I'm not
Louder than louder.
I think you're enjoying their hot or they're
Yeah.
there. So I know we talked a little bit about, or we talked about, the concept of, I guess, fixing a disorder or what have you they had in the sense of Parkinson's and restoring that kind of lost identity that they might have lost over the course of 5 years. How does that necessarily change if you're born with a malady or what have you that kind of alters the perception on the world and removes the capacity to relate to much of society in the sense that you find it hard to relate with others who maybe you did not necessarily grow up with. And it's like, can you necessarily fix that and remain having your own identity, or does necessarily treating a inherent difference is that removing you from your own individuality, your identity, because that it kind of removes you from in a relationship that you have with others you've grown up with.
So I don't accept the claim that you can lose your identity. I think you just always have it. It just may not be the one you like, or it may not be the one that you want to own or the one that you want to claim. But I don't think you can ever lose your identity because your identity just is your story. So one of the ways in which I've engaged with this debate more recently outside the context of neurotechnologies is with respect to mitochondrial replacement. So I don't know how many of you know that science or not, but in the world of reproductive technologies, there is the opportunity to change the human embryo prior to implantation. So very quick, just in terms of making the science accessible, if you can do this in the egg or the embryo, but I'm going to describe it in the embryo. So you've got an embryo, and it's got a nucleus, which has got your nuclear DNA, and then surrounding that you've got your mitochondrial DNA, and there are certain illnesses that are a result of dysfunctional mitochondrial DNA. And so the idea is that you would then replace that mitochondrial DNA with healthy mitochondrial DNA. You would go on and have a child that would be born. And a number of government reports have said that one of the problems with this technology is that it's a threat to identity. And so I've gotten involved and say, really? That's total hogwash. Like, really? What is it that you think? Oh, well, the mitochondrial DNA that was defective is going to have made for a certain person being born. And the mitochondrial DNA that's now healthy will make for a different person being born. And now you're getting close to perfect, right? And we're worried about, is it the same person? And I'm saying, in terms of what's meaningful about identity, there is only one person, right? And that person is either going to have the trajectory of a person with mitochondrial disease, or they're going to have the trajectory of a person without mitochondrial disease. Will they be different? Yes, but there was no identity that was lost in any way, shape, or form along that trajectory. The embryo with the unhealthy mitochondria did not have an identity which then got lost by being replaced with healthy mitochondria. Now, I know that's not the example that you're giving, but I think it's an example where people are trying to claim that there was something from the get-go that was this identity. And I thought in part because you were sort of saying, well, what if you were already born with a particular kind of illness as opposed to something, like late onset Parkinson's, etc. And my claim is that from the moment you want to start that story, whether you want to start it as the embryo, whether you want to start it as the fetus, whether you want to start it as the newborn, there just is one story. And so I think if you embrace the notion of narrative, which not everybody does, but if you sort of give me that as a starting point, then you can never lose your identity. All that can happen is that the identity can shift, and there can be a sense that you have more or less control over it, and I think that most people try to exert control over it, and some do that more or less successfully, because some people are just literally better at navigating the social world. And so, you know, they have a better sense of control over where they're going. So I don't know if that helps, but I think for me it's a really key point that you can't lose your identity, and there's no point at which you lost your identity even during a life trajectory.
And if I can ask kind of just a shift or a follow-up to that in a sense, then how can you decide almost in terms of shifting? Is there a point that, you know, is there a point when you decide that you need to shift that identity? I can kind of understand the mitochondrial thing to prevent, like, you know, some sort of metabolic deficiency later on in life or what have you, but is necessarily shifting that story, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Who makes that decision? Is it that person, or is it, you know, their loved ones, or the medical practitioner?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, because I do not believe that all shifts in identity are healthy. And I think that that's one of the things that's important to appreciate. And so I think that it's important not to sort of tie a narrative, a normative assessment to a particular kind of narrative. So something can happen which seems to take the trajectory in a different direction, but what happens doesn't necessarily get perceived as healthy. So let's think about something like gender. And so I walk around in the world and most people think that I'm a woman and it happens to correspond with my sex, and so life is just fine for me. But what happens if I actually am not just fine with that, and so I actually am taking a number of steps, etc., to present myself to the world as a gendered male? And the world is either at some point going to embrace that or is going to resist that, etc. And it's in that context where I'm trying to negotiate a particular identity with the world, and it really matters in terms of where I'm going to be able to go with that identity, how the world will either help me to instantiate it or not. And so that's what I mean in part. I mean, and I'm taking something that's like sort of dramatic for people to be able to see, but that's what I mean when I say it's constantly being negotiated. And that's one of the things that I think is really important, because if I'm not going to get support for the gender that I want to claim, I might try to find a community where I will, etc. And if I don't find it, it might be very unhealthy for me. But I think it's really important to disconnect the normative assessment from what might be any other kind of assessment of the narrative. So you can have narratives that are unhealthy, but they just are your narrative.
Thank you so much for your talk, which I found really interesting, and I find your notion of this negotiated space where identity becomes very compelling. But while you were talking, I kept kind of wanting to push back just a little bit and find some sort of role for a core self. And I keep thinking to myself, you know, how is it that one can articulate that perhaps within the kind of framework that you described? And so one of the things that I was thinking very roughly, and I'm not sure I can even articulate this properly, but I'm going to try, is just as we have these narratives about our own individual identities, we also have these meta-narratives about what the self is. An important one of those narratives is an idea that we do have something like a core self, even though it's in conflict perhaps with other kinds of narratives we have. And I was just thinking that part of that kind of negotiated identity that we have is precisely trying to negotiate with other people, what is my core self? You know, that is an idea I have, which is then something that may come into conflict with, and that is contested with ideas that other people have. And that itself, to me, seemed like something quite significant, even though that's not a core self in the way a lot of people kind of want to grab onto the idea. It seemed to me still a very significant idea that we don't necessarily want to lose, even if it's in conflict, even if it doesn't really make sense very much. And I kind of started to feel, well, isn't that something like a core self? And that it may be slightly more significant than a rhetorical device or something like that.
So that's a really important and interesting question, and where I would go with that is I think that those kinds of claims really are pointing to claims that we make about integrity, right? So people will say that I can't do that. So they'll make a conscience claim, for example, because that threatens my integrity. I am not that kind of person. I am not the kind of person that could participate in physician-assisted suicide. That would be a threat to my core sense of self. And I've done some work around that where I've tried to actually suggest that the problem with that is that we're thinking then of integrity as a personal virtue. And I think that there's room to think about integrity as a social virtue. And if we think about integrity as a social virtue, then it's about preparing ourselves to be in the world and in community with others. So I don't have any difficulty with saying that there are core personality traits that we value and that we try to hold on to and that we think of as important. But I think I put them in the category of personality traits, and that's where I tried to make the claim before that I think there's a difference between personal identity and personality traits or character traits writ large. And I think sometimes it's hard to see that difference, but I think that's why I put the emphasis on the narrative, and that's where other people have some input and control. It doesn't mean that they don't read off of me and I don't behave in such a way that they say, you know, the one thing I can tell you about Françoise Baylis is she's rock solid, honest. Whether I am or not, you know, who knows, right? Or they might say, you know, she's a person who always keeps her promises. I guarantee every one of you in this room, if I were to pick a particular person and I said, tell me who that person is, you would be able to point to a trait that you think just instantiates that person. But what I'm saying back to you is, yeah, that's an important trait, and around that you then interpret lots of things. So if Françoise is a person who always keeps her promises and today she didn't, what's going on? Right? Because it's what allows us to live in community with others is that we have these kinds of sort of descriptors or caricatures that allow us to navigate the world precisely, because if we had to call that into question every time, we couldn't actually work, right? And so it's just like in ethics, you know, you certainly have certain kind of rules that say, well, you know, always do the greatest good for the greatest number, and it just allows you to kind of make decisions quickly as you go through. I think that's what happens with relationships, right? We know that she told me, yes, she keeps her promises, I can count on it, and we just go on, right? Oh, I know this person's completely unreliable, they're never there on time, and so I arrange my life around it. So it's not that we don't have descriptors for people and that we don't think that those accurately characterize them, but I don't know that I want to go so far as to say that there's a core identity, because it doesn't make much sense to me to say that you can lose your identity. And that's what happens if you make the claim of authenticity. If there is a true self, then that self could get lost or could become under threat, and I don't know how to make sense of that in the context of a narrative arc.
We have Darren and then Allison.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk.
Aaron, can
Can't hear you.
Sorry, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk.
Yes, say that more loudly.
Into the mic.
And I think you made the relational case for identity very, very plausible. I'm going to look over here, not over here where you also are. But I wondered if you could speak to the issue of unhealthy relationships, right? So there is in this literature around DBS, stories of spouses, right, who say, I really don't like what he's become, right? He's now impulsive, he's interested in having sex all the time. I would really like the docile husband that I used to have, right? And there are ways in which within that relationship and the negotiation of who he really is as however that negotiation is, right? About the real him or the him that will come out of the equilibrium, right? There are ways in which that spouse might push that identity in ways that benefit her, right? I don't mean that in a bad way, but just that their diseases are often really hard on both patients and caregivers, right? And there are ways in which sometimes we do things that make our lives easier. And so I could imagine that that we want to say that it's not just wherever the equilibrium happens to push him, right? And wherever he ends up is the identity that he has. We want to say there's some normative constraints on where that equilibrium, where we're comfortable saying that equilibrium can push him in the end. And so I'm just wondering kind of what you think of that.
I guess part of what I wanted to say back is in the story that you're telling, I mean, the wife just doesn't like the relationship, right? Like the relationship has changed in a way that's just not happy for her, right? So my view is, well, get out of it. I mean, if that's not the relationship you want to be in. So otherwise, I mean, what is it that you're saying? You're saying that there was a real person there, and that's the real person I liked, and this person has changed, I don't like this person anymore, and I want the other person. And that seems to me a very strange thing to be saying, except if you're using it as a rhetorical device, which is to say, I like the traits of character that this person had before. This particular person has these other traits of character that I don't particularly like. There's a methodology which would get me back in time to a person with other traits of character. And then for that to happen, the person would have to want to change that as well. And the reality of it is we all try to change people around us all the time. Like, you know, I try to get my husband not to squeeze the toothpaste in a particular way, not to put the toilet roll a certain way, to put, I mean, I'm just realizing that all the examples I was about to give her in the bathroom. That's not so good. But I think there's a difference between saying, look, I don't like the way the person is behaving, and you try to negotiate the person behaving a different kind of way, a way that, you know, fits with whatever your likes or dislikes are in the world. But I don't know that you could ever say that those behaviors are under my control. They could be negotiated. But again, I'm still struggling to try to figure out why those behaviors are the identity of the person. So help me out a little bit more.
Well, so I mean, let's say that it's more him claiming that this is, you know, I'm, you know, I now view myself as a person who's freewheeling.
Okay.
And she says, no, that's not who you are. That doesn't fit with the whole arc of your life. And here, let me tell you why. You know, here's our life together. Here's kind of how you were in the past. And,
yeah, but I say back to you, but that's who I am now. And I mean, you don't have to like who I am now, and you may think I'm breaking some promises in our relationship, and maybe I'm an asshole, but yeah, I am the freewheeling guy now. And what do you say back to me? No, you're really not the freewheeling guy? I mean, so that's exactly, I think that's exactly what I want to say. So you may not like it, and I may be very comfortable with it, and the reality of it is at some point, if I keep acting in that way, so I'm going to meet the reality constraint, my behaviors in fact correspond to that. The credibility constraint, people are looking around and saying, yep, that's what I see this guy doing, so yep, that's who they are. And then when you get to my claim that I'm trying to make about, you know, trying to look for equilibrium, right? If I can't establish that with you, that doesn't mean that I'm not establishing it with all kinds of other people, that they're busy to say, yep, that's who that person is. They are this freewheeling kind of guy. So I think you cannot like a person that you loved very deeply at one point. I think people can develop personality traits that, you know, push other people away, and then what happens is you move out of that circle of belonging, which is why at the beginning my sort of first response is say, if you don't like the relationship, you either try to negotiate one that's different, and if you really don't like the relationship, you leave. But I don't know how you get to turn around and say, but that's not the real person. That is the person. They've evolved in a way that you don't find interesting, you maybe don't want to be with them anymore, and that can be all very sad. But that's in fact what happens in the world. I mean, you know, let's say I'm a person that, you know, was homophobic, and that's how I behaved in the world, and people say, yeah, I know that woman, homophobic, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, a person that I love and care deeply about, you know, comes out of the closet and says, look, you know, you're actually attacking me. And I say, oh my goodness, you? And then I go back and I think, you know, how could I must have gotten something wrong here, because I really love this person and I wouldn't want to attack. And I now start thinking, and now I'm out there, I'm the LGBTQ activist, blah, 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 and you say, well, I don't like that Françoise Baylis, I like that homophobic person, and I have a right to demand that she come back, because that was a core part of her personality. She in fact lived her life in such a way that I, you know, whatever the story would be, I don't know. And so what I'm saying is, you know, can features of a personality change? Yeah. I'm still the same person. I'm just a person who was a homophobic pig before, and now I'm a person who's like, you know, an interesting, open-minded, whatever, but I'm still that person. And what matters is that I am that person who can look back on that history and say, yeah, I was that homophobic pig at some point. But that's who I am. I am that person who had, you know, the language I used in the presentation was a rupture, right? You can have ruptures, right, and very dramatic ruptures that make you seem different in the world, but you are still that person. You are that person with that trajectory. And it probably makes a difference to how you are today that you had that particular trajectory.
Can I just add to this though, because I think it's a really interesting point, and then I will get you. Just that it seems like there's a difference in your story that you just told, because there is a relational thing that happens, and there's a certain reason that's given, right? And so we can use that language of an evolution, even if it feels like it's relatively quick. And I think sometimes the point about the DBS devices or the side effects is it doesn't seem like there's an evolution. It's a
Absolutely.
It's this thing that changed.
Sure, and that was where the point I was trying to make, that I think the issue there is the control mechanism that is seen to be disrupted. That as opposed to thinking that, oh, Françoise Baylis had control over the shift in her beliefs because she was confronted with this fact about the world, and then she thought about it, and she da-da-da. We think of that as, therefore I own it, right? And therefore there's some control. Whereas some doc came along, zapped me, some pill came along, changed my chemistry, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, right, in some sense. So I think the idea there is the fact that the change has been brought about without willful intent or without consent or without any of those kinds of things that we think are important doesn't mean that the change hasn't occurred. And the change is a change in personality, which either then gets negotiated in a social space and therefore gets entrenched, or if it doesn't get negotiated, it might still morph and change. But I guess part of what I'm responding to is the idea that somehow, you know, the truth of the self is a function of external control as opposed to internal control, and that can't make sense in the claim I'm making, because I've already said me's out here. Yeah. And so if me's out here, I then have to, I'm more likely to have to give in to what Tim's asking me at the beginning to say, well, if me's out here, doesn't that mean that parts of that could be given over to machines, to drugs, to this or to that? And ultimately I have to say yes to that, because it's what follows from the kind of claim I'm making. Otherwise I have to say no, there's this true me that's got to be protected.
Else.
So I'm really compelled by the the anti-essentialism. There's no authentic, true me that. I'm down with that. And I see why you would run a line where you're really critical of the idea that there are threats to identity when they're formulated in terms of threats to some authentic, essential meaning that's been disrupted or changed. But I wonder if there isn't still room for language of threat to identity, because if, like, in the middle part of your talk when you were saying, well, it's not the intervention, it's the disease itself, or look at how the relationships have changed and the capacity to fulfill certain roles and expectations, fulfill certain kind of relational expectations have changed. It seems to me maybe those were not direct, like the relational effects and the role effects and so on, but they're indirect relational effects of the intervention. And if somebody has a narrative that's about them being an accomplished professor and these are the relationships that matter to me, and as the prince of the institute, it should have been my kingdom for whatever, however that plays out. And all of that is changed. Why does it not make sense to say that some combination of the disease and the intervention and the follow-on effects on performance capacities and relationships and so on, why does it not make sense to say that those are threats to identity? In your relational sense.
Well, see, I think that claim can only make sense if I give up my claim about it being dynamic as opposed to static, authentic, true, core. Because to me, to be able to say that there's something that's under threat is different between saying there's a particular trajectory that I would like, and it looks like it's not going to go that way. I'm not going to have control of the story in the way that I want. So I can understand that, right? And if that's what you're saying is that, look, I want to go off on this pathway because that's how I choose to see myself. I want to see myself as this kind, caring person, and it looks like I've got these other behaviors that aren't going to be read and seen by the world in that way. But this is really the story that I like. I like the story of the kind, compassionate Françoise. I will do things, and those are under my control. But I think for me, at least in the context of the language of threat, it only makes sense against a backdrop of authenticity. So I did say at some point in the presentation that if you buy the language of authenticity, then it is as true that the treatment or the underlying illness could be seen as the threat depending on what it is that you value about your sense of self, right? And so I do think it's possible to say that I value a particular sense of myself, and I'm trying to project that into the world, and I'm trying to protect that particular narrative, and I'm trying to bolster that narrative, and I'm going to take on commitments, activities, relationships that will all foster that. So I'm not saying that there isn't any kind of intent, and I'm also not saying that I couldn't sort of say like, ooh, yeah, but if I behave in this way, that's not going to help support the kind of narrative that I'm trying to project. I guess I'm just not using it as a threat in the sense of the threat being against a true self as contrasted with a threat that might be against a narrative that I'm trying to support. So does that, yeah, so I guess that would be a way in which you could sort of imagine it as a threat against a narrative that I'm trying to uphold and defend.
And threats against your capacity to enact narratives that you know. So I guess I don't see why, in general, the language of threat has to be displaced, because you could see lots of threats. Right? The other question comes up in connection with an answer you gave earlier, and you said, well, there's just one narrative you can have.
Oh, I didn't.
It was in response to your question, and you said, well, there's just the one me, and you can have one narrative. And why, on your account, did you not have multiple narratives? Think about people who move between very different contexts, insider, outsider accounts, and so on, where a constitutive part of their relational identity is that they can be very different people and narrate their lives in very different ways.
Right, so it may be just a way in which I misstated. I'm not saying that you can't, let me back up. Mariah Scheckman worked on a paper for a collected edition that I had where I asked her specifically to look at multiple personality disorder. And in that context, we had exactly this kind of exchange and conversation. And at the end of the day, I think both she and I were of the view that even if you had that kind of a disorder, you still had one overarching narrative. So I think that's where maybe, and I'm not sure, maybe when I answered the previous question, I misspoke, or at least I wasn't clear about it. I'm not saying that you couldn't have different perceptions of what that narrative is, because that's partly what you're negotiating with other people at all times in this sort of, you know, subconscious kind of way. But I guess I do at the end of the day think there is an overarching narrative, and it would be one narrative, for example, that would even capture the person with a multiple personality disorder who might think that they could tell separate narratives, right? This is the narrative of Charlie, and this is the narrative of Mary Sue, etc. But I would say, no, there's a narrative which makes sense of all of those sub-narratives as one overarching narrative.
So that would be like Corinna's meta-narrative, in a sense.
Maybe, yeah.
I want to have the narrative of the compassionate MC, and we are way past time for lunch. But I invite you, keep your questions, especially if you can be here for lunch, and we're going to have after lunch, and we're going to have a panel at the end of everybody again. Or feel free to come and bring your questions right now if they're pressing and you can't stop them. But otherwise, I hope you'll come back, and we'll start again at 2 with the talk from Dr. Karen Romelfinger. Thank you. And if you aren't from here, in the hub, in the basement level, there's a big food court with lots of food, and for the speakers and commentators, we have box lunches coming here.
Great.